Welcome everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today. I'm going to hand over to our CEO, Dr. Anthony Ribbick, to do a quick recap of the past sessions we've had.
Thank you very much, Tara. Right, this program, as most of you should know by now, is directed at developing national and regional action plans that will assist countries better manage their plastic and their plastic waste in particular, and ultimately we hope move them towards zero plastics to the environment and zero plastics to the seas. And it started off very well with Abu Bamba from the Abidjan Convention, who's well known to all of those in the Abidjan region, who introduced the need and the problems which actually the West African countries actually face. And this was discussed at some length by most of the participants. This was followed by Linda Godfrey. Professor Godfrey was a principal participant in the development of the Africa Waste Management Outlook. And she drew from that the issues that pertain to Africa that are really important for consideration in the development of action plans nationally and regionally. Then we had a discussion panel to explore further these issues and particularly the challenges going forward. And that was what the participants in that were Thomas Mice, Percy Oninawa, and Linda Godfrey. And they were talking about the primary drivers and the sources of plastic waste and the value that the valuable information and experience that they had, again, to help us develop the action plans necessary. From there, we started to move into the plastics issues themselves. And Do Steyn, the Sustainability Director from Plastics SA, spoke about the issues not only in South Africa, but also the issues elsewhere in Africa. He was accompanied by Daniel Yor Turingo, who spoke about the Ghanaian experience and the Ghanaian problems there. And what they were looking at there are the actions that producers and converters should be taking, because producers and converters set the scene for recycling and to some extent determine whether or not certain plastics can be recycled. This was followed by Aiva from Grid Arendelle, and she discussed plans to better manage raw and virgin materials, because these definitely, and particularly the fuel price, the oil price, definitely affects the way in which plastic waste are managed. And then we had an introduction into plastics themselves and how it's necessary to better understand plastics and the different polymers. And this is given to us by Annabi Pretorius, who is really a fund of all knowledge. Today, we're very fortunate to have David Drew, who's joined us, and he's from Coca-Cola. He's going to be talking to us about extended producer responsibility. I'm very impressed by what I've learned about David. I've actually not met him before, but it's a pleasure for me to introduce you to him. He is he's actually currently sustainability director for Coca-Cola, but he has a passion for the environment. And what impressed me deeply is he's thinking about the environment, he's thinking about the issues, and he's thinking about how aspects can actually pertain to the countries of Africa, not just those countries in the Abidjan Convention, but Africa in general, and how can we move Africa forward? And it's going to be interesting to have him in the discussions later on as well. But for today, the focus is going to be on extended producer responsibility. For those of you who would like to know more about him, the document has been circulated, which gives you an insight, but certainly you can also visit the web. David, from us, a very warm welcome. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward greatly to
Merci d'être avec nous.
And the contributions that you believe should be made to the development of national and regional action plans. So, David, over to you. Thank you indeed.
Thank you very much, Tony. Let me try and get my screen up and running. If you can confirm that it's all in place and you can
It's
see
up.
it.
Thank you.
Great. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and potentially good evening. I'm not sure where everyone is out there in the world. I'm sure none of us are particularly enjoying the impact of COVID, but I have to say that I think one of the lasting benefits of this unusual disruption to our lives will be our increased exposure to shared ideas through platforms like this. And so I'm very grateful for the invitation, and I really hope today that I'll do justice to the medium and make the time that you've taken today to spend with us worthwhile. So today I'll be sharing some thoughts on EPR, or extended producer responsibility, and in particular the differences between voluntary EPR and mandatory EPR. Of course, before deciding whether you need to go voluntary or regulated, you need to understand what EPR is. And although I'm sure many of you will have a sense of what EPR entails, I think it's important to start with a quick recap of what EPR is exactly and build from there. So the way I like to sort of position this is that societies across the world share many of the same needs, but they've developed vastly different solutions to these very same challenges. So these solutions develop not only in response to the need itself, but they are heavily influenced by the context. The society, the geography, the economic environment all contribute significantly to the solutions that evolve. We often look for best practice or ideas that develop independently elsewhere and adapt them where we can. But sometimes we have to accept that what works in one part of the world simply won't work in another. However, when it comes to waste management and recycling, I think we tend to be a bit more utopian in our approach. We see what happens in the developed world in particular, and imagine that the solutions to recycling look something like this: return vending machines, multicolored bins, curbside collection, and automated recycling plants that can ingeniously separate our waste into all its different useful plants. Our current reality in South Africa and in many other developing countries is more like this: far less sophisticated, but not necessarily that much less effective. It may seem hard to believe, but many emerging countries have comparable or better collection recycling rates for some materials than the USA, for example. So now when it comes to bullet trains or some other amazing public infrastructure we might see in large international cities, we seem to accept that these fantastic solutions might be out of our price range, as it were, or maybe be a solution for 2030 or 2050 in some city of the future. When it comes to recycling, however, we're far less patient. We seem to want and expect these kinds of solutions now, and rightly so. Why shouldn't we have these things now? Why should we live in polluted cities with poor or non-existent waste management? The challenge is that, like bullet trains, these solutions are not free. And so governments everywhere are grappling with the challenge of providing the kinds of services citizens want, but simply don't have the money for. As you can imagine then, a concept which suggests that the producers of products that become waste should pay for it to be collected and recycled starts to sound like a really good idea. And that's why EPR, or extended producer responsibility, is gaining traction globally. But what exactly is EPR? Although it has slightly different interpretations across the world, extended producer responsibility is a concept that links the producer of waste with the cost of cleaning up the waste. It's kind of like insisting that dog walkers use a pooper scooper. If you have a dog and you want to walk in the park with a dog, then you need to clean up after your dog. In principle, it seeks to link the external or indirect costs or consequences of making something or using something with the cost of using that material. The more difficult it is to properly manage a material after use, the more cost should be attached to using that material in the first place, in the form of an EPR fee. So this concept is called ecomodulation, and it should, if correctly applied, encourage better material choices and product design. So if you're a producer of plastic packaging, you have a responsibility to ensure that that plastic can be properly managed after it's been used. I say managed because there's actually no implicit requirement for recycling in EPR, but it's important that you prevent the product having a negative impact on the environment. So recycling is therefore just one of a number of potential solutions. Now, it's generally impractical for individuals or even individual companies to try and address these kinds of issues alone. And so we form or contribute to what are called producer responsibility organizations, like Petco. As a collective, we seek to address the need to properly manage the impact of the products we make after they've been used. So PROs, like Petco, are the way in which we as industry will normally meet these obligations. Most EPR legislation does allow for the possibility that producers can set up their own EPR scheme, but these are less common and have some important conditions. The most important being that if you go alone, you must only collect your own products and not those of your competitors. So individual compliance schemes are most often used for things like returnable packaging. And so producer responsibility organizations with multiple members are far more common. EPR regulations generally have some common goals, like reducing the use of unnecessary materials and increasing recycling. But in South Africa, in the South African context, we potentially have some social aspects to extend a producer responsibility. And other developing countries might have a similar vision for EPR. So now understanding that the obligations of PROs and environment where we have both governmental, municipal, and private sector operating can be difficult. So I'm going to try and show you how I think it's easiest to understand EPR in the context of these different players. So the way I like to look at it is that EPR is about closing the gap. What gap, you say? Well, recycling is a business, okay? People make money from recycling. We all talk about the opportunities in the circular economy. Well, I want you to think about the recycling value chain in two halves. On the left-hand side, you have the cost of collecting, sorting, cleaning, processing the recyclables into a form that can be used by a converter. On the right-hand side, you have what the converter is willing to pay for that recycled material. It's a principle common to many commercial supply chains. The best comparison, however, I think, is probably mining. So as most of you know, South African economy is largely built on gold mining. So let's consider gold mining as an example. Gold is extracted from deep in the rock, deep underground. The ore is crushed, treated to isolate the gold, and then the gold is refined and finally sold. Now, like mining, the challenge with recycling is that sometimes the cost to recover and process the recyclables exceeds the value that someone's willing to pay for it. So like mining, the end-use price can be influenced by market forces over which you have no control. The oil price, for example, rand-dollar exchange rate, COVID-19 crisis. Now in mining, when the gold price or the iron ore price or whatever you choose to be mining falls, or your local currency, in our case the rand, strengthens versus the dollar, we hear about mines closing shafts or shutting down. But it's important to realize they aren't shutting down because there's no gold left. They stop operating because it now doesn't make economic sense to continue. In recycling, the same applies. At times, it doesn't make economic sense to keep recycling, or it only makes sense to dig so deep, as it were, go so far, collect so much material. The difference is that we aren't okay with recyclables being left on our curbside or being sent to landfill when this happens. And so EPR is about closing the economic gap to ensure that recycling continues even when it would otherwise not make economic sense. Now, the challenge with recycling is that this value chain must typically interact with the broader sphere of waste management. Waste management is generally a service provided by governments or municipalities, and so sometimes we forget or ignore the cost of providing these services. I think most of us can understand that providing these services for general waste costs money, but when it comes to recycling, we tend to jump to the conclusion that collecting recyclables is now a profitable enterprise. This is unfortunately seldom true. So if we want recycling to be universal, the challenge becomes, how are we going to pay for it? As I see it, there are typically four models most commonly employed to pay for it. And at the center of all of these is you and I, the consumer. Governments can encourage recycling through policy, taxes, and incentives, and in some cases even operate the recycling systems themselves. Most commonly, municipalities integrate recycling into the broader waste management, and citizens essentially pay for these services through their rates. They can also incentivize recycling through landfill fees or pay-as-you-throw systems. Deposit return systems, or DRS, as they're commonly known, can be applied for some products, and they essentially put the responsibility on the consumer. the consumer pays a deposit on the product that they buy, and they only get it back when they return the empty bottle, for example. In contrast, EPR systems see the industry take the lead in both raising and deploying the funding to enable recycling, and governments and society in general then hold industry or the producers accountable for the results that they achieve. A successful system clearly needs alignment with state and municipal policy, but I believe that in most environments, EPR-based systems can not only achieve better results, but can do it at lower costs. And if the costs are ultimately being passed on to the consumer, then this is really important in emerging markets. So, I know that some of you are going to be challenging my earlier assertion that recycling needs assistance. So let me expand a bit. The reality is that value chains for different materials and different environments have a huge impact on the need for EPR. Many recyclable materials will be recycled with little or no assistance at low levels. A colleague of mine calls this organic recycling, or perhaps unassisted recycling is a better term. For PET, this is typically in the range of 15 to 30%, depending on the socioeconomic environment. Studies that we've actually commissioned as Coca-Cola have demonstrated in some cases these rates are obviously often inversely proportional to the GDP. In other words, the poorer the country is, sometimes the higher the unassisted recycling rate is for things like PET. So yes, you don't always need to fund recycling. But then again, we are not going to be satisfied with 20 or 30% collection of PET, are we? The challenge is that as we increase the recycling rates, the costs tend to escalate, and the gap we spoke about earlier starts to open. To increase the recycling rate, we have to pay more to a collector or a waste collection company. We have to travel further to pick up bottles from smaller towns outside of the major cities. And we have to accept colored bottles and dirtier bottles, increasing the potential process losses. All of these factors increase the costs on the left-hand side of the graph and increase that EPR gap. And so whilst at 20%, we possibly didn't have a gap, at 60%, we now have a relatively large gap. Now, as I said, the value chains are different for different materials in different places. PET has a relatively high processing cost, and by that I mean the effort and energy required to turn a discarded bottle into a material that can be used to make a new one is fairly high. Aluminium, on the other hand, has very little processing cost. Recycled aluminium, commonly called UBC, can be thrown into a furnace at a rolling mill with very little processing. And this is one of the reasons why the street value of cans can be so much higher than the street value of PET bottles. Glass also has a very low processing cost. You just throw it in the furnace. But unlike aluminium, the value of virgin material sets a very low benchmark. And this is why one of the reasons why glass has a very low street value. And so we can conclude that collection recycling will not be equivalent for different materials. This is particularly pronounced in an environment where we rely largely on informal collection. And so it's very relevant in Africa. For informal collection, street value is key. Materials with some value will be collected. Those with more value will be collected in higher percentages, and those without any assistance. And so what's important to realize is that we can see over time the needs of collection systems change. And this means that the kinds of policies and approaches that governments use in relation to waste management EPR must also change. This evolution of policy and approach is something that we see across the world today. I realize that the animation of the previous slide may have been a little hard to follow, so perhaps this graph will explain it a little bit more clearly. To understand why there's a need for change, I think it's important to consider the implications of this typical cost to collect versus collection percentage trend. Okay, so the wavy line that I've got on there. As you can see, it costs nothing to recover nothing, but as you want to collect more, the more expensive it becomes. In theory, as you can see, the cost of collecting everything rises asymptotically to infinity. The absolute numbers and transition points will differ by material, geography, socioeconomic environment, but the trend is fairly consistent. On the left, we have what I called earlier organic or unassisted collection, i.e., it just happens. There's no formal or informal support needed. There's enough recyclable material that's cheap enough to access and recycle for low levels of collection to be possible without any help. In this phase, the value of the recovered material is essentially financing the system. There are many African countries that find themselves in this space currently for some materials. Materials like PET bottles, aluminum cans, some HDPE bottles, and in some places, things like clear LDPE film. In other words, we have unassisted entrepreneurial collection and recycling at relatively low levels of collection. However, it's important to realize that in this space, we have many materials that aren't being collected at all. And so we can't rely on organic recycling to solve our problems. To move the collection rate to the right, we need to do something. And the first step in this direction is often voluntary EPR-led initiatives, normally by corporates. But these initiatives could also be driven by communities and municipalities. Where proactive industry is involved, these initiatives can be individually implemented. By that, I mean by one company, or they can be more formalized in the form of producer responsibility organizations like PETCO that we spoke about earlier. Critically, however, in this space, it's not legislated, universal, or compulsory. In this space, we can often see a significant shift in the collection recycling rates of materials because the gap to close is generally relatively small. If you look at the slope, it's very shallow. The economies of scale of collection have kicked in. And so with relatively little intervention or financial support, the collection rate can increase significantly. However, the effectiveness of voluntary EPR also tends to have limits depending on the levels of participation or inconsistencies between materials and industries. Because the curves for each material will differ, some materials may be doing very well under voluntary EPR. And by that, I mean achieving the desired levels of collection, but others not so much. We see this across in South Africa today within our PROs. Again, however, we tend to see voluntary initiatives being focused on the items that are easiest to collect and recycle, or those facing potential policy or sanctions. This means, again, that many materials are not part of voluntary initiatives, and often these are the most troubling from environmental perspectives. And so governments come under pressure to act to increase the rate of collection more broadly, and in particular across the challenging materials. And hopefully, the next step in regulation is mandatory or universal EPR regulation. And as you can see on the graph, this is generally necessary when the costs begin to increase and the results from voluntary EPR seem to start to stagnate. In South Africa, we are currently at this transition point between voluntary and regulated EPR. Essentially, we believe now that in order to increase collection and recycling rates further for the materials that are already being collected, and in some cases to start collection of things not being collected, or perhaps to eliminate them entirely, we need the additional resources and economic intervention that results from regulated EPR. And it doesn't end there. Even EPR systems can have their limits. In many countries in Europe, EPR has successfully established collection systems that achieve greater than 75% collection. And that's taken, in some cases, 10 to 15 years. But there's still pressure from society to do more. And so Europe is seeing a further transition from EPR-led systems to regulated solutions like DRS or container deposit systems, as they're sometimes called. But we also see that at this point, regulation isn't limited to EPR. And it typically includes things like virgin plastic tax and legislated recycled content. But what's important to realize is that these changing policies are part of an evolutionary process, and each step builds on the other. DRS, for example, is generally only applied to beverages, which means that if you apply DRS, you need an EPR system that's looking after everything else before you put the DRS in place. And so mandatory EPR is typically the step before DRS. As I mentioned, in South Africa, we are currently transitioning from a voluntary EPR environment to a regulated or mandatory EPR environment. And this is a very important change. Although voluntary EPR and regulated EPR have the same intent, it's really important to understand that they are fundamentally different in one critical aspect. I attended a lecture many years ago, and I can't remember the name of the physicist that said this. I wish I could give him credit. But his rather flippant answer to the question, how did the Big Bang came about, always stuck with me. He said, in the beginning, there was nothing. Therefore, there were no rules. Therefore, anything could happen. It's appropriate for today's discussion because the fundamental difference between voluntary EPR and regulated EPR is about rules. For South Africa, this has been the biggest challenge because over the past 10 to 15 years, EPR has been done in an environment without clear rules. So the biggest challenge for regulated EPR is setting rules and setting them well. When there are no rules, you can decide whether you want to belong to a PRO or not. When there are no rules, you can decide which materials you will belong to a PRO for and pay EPR fees and which you won't. When there are no rules, you can decide how to run your PRO, who belongs to your PRO, who leads the PRO, who pays the EPR fees, and who sits on the board. When there are no rules, you can choose the KPIs that you will report and how you'll measure them. And this is exactly what happened in South Africa and in a number of other countries. And all of this needs to change when you move to regulated EPR. The evolution of PROs has in many cases had to be a step-by-step process. Countries have implemented mandatory EPR and realized the weaknesses of their regulations over time and had to change them. So for those of us following their footsteps, it's quite useful to try and learn from some of their mistakes and try and avoid them. When you move from voluntary EPR to regulated EPR, many think that it's just a matter of forcing the so-called free riders, by that I mean those that didn't participate in the voluntary EPR, to join PROs. Simple. But it's far more than that. It fundamentally changes belonging to a PRO and how PROs are established and operated. Under regulated EPR, you need to clearly identify the products to which the regulation will apply and who's the producer. You need to set the rules for establishing a PRO, who must belong to it and how it should be governed. Typically, PROs or producers running their own schemes need to report to government regularly, and so you need to set the rules for reporting. You need clear and practical definitions. What do you mean by collection rate, recycling, reuse, recycled content? How will you ensure that all the producers pull their weight and pay their fees? Then if you're going to allow multiple PROs, which most systems do, you then need to collect the data and collate it and bring it together in a meaningful way so that you can report national data. Now, we don't have time today to go through all the elements of well-regulated EPR system, but if you have some questions later, I'm sure I can answer them. But I would like to just highlight one example of why the elements that often seem simple are actually much more complex than you may think. In the context of regulated EPR, it's important to appreciate that without clearly identifying the producer, you have a major challenge. Under voluntary EPR, the producers, let's call them, and I use that term loosely, come together voluntarily to achieve a shared purpose. In South Africa, many of the voluntary organizations included a variety of players from the value chain. In the case of Petco, we still have raw material producers, packaging converters, bottlers, brand owners, and even recyclers. But in the context of regulated EPR, it's impractical to consider everyone as the producer. Under law, who will be held accountable? And this is even more important in terms of packaging because typically packaging is subject to EPR, but often the items in the packaging are not. So when EPR refers to an item, often it's not beverages, it's plastic packaging around beverages. So if we take the example of the beer shown on the screen, is it the beer maker or the bottle maker that's the producer? Is it the McDonald's? Is it McDonald's in the case of the McDonald's cup? Or is it the maker of the paper cup? Or perhaps the maker of the paper in the paper cup? All could be considered the producer under some definitions. So if regulation doesn't address this, it becomes problematic. And it actually could undermine the voluntary efforts already in place. So to answer the question, who is the producer? We do know, for example, that best practice globally is that the producer is considered to be the brand owner, retailer, and in the case where neither are present, the importer. I saw a definition recently that I really liked from Rob van Hill from the Moss Group, and he said, basically the way to think about it is that the producer was the local owner or agent of the brand you see on the product that is subject to EPR. So if it says Osram on the box of the light, Osram is the producer. If it says Coca-Cola, Coca-Cola is the producer. If it says Pepsi, Pepsi is the producer. So if plastic bottles are covered by EPR, then typically the brand on the label would be considered the producer. Now, clearly you might be asking, as a representative of Coca-Cola, although I'm here in my capacity as a Petco director today, would be suggesting that the brand owner should be considered as the producer, because obviously that means Coca-Cola. Well, for me, the answer is relatively simple. There are actually a few reasons. Firstly, as you can see from this charming image that went viral, the general public has already made up this decision for me. No one cares who actually made the bottle or can. When your brand washes up on a beach, the public link responsibility with the name on the bottle. Secondly, and really importantly from a regulated EPR point of view, brand owners have far more alignment with the objective of EPR than some other members of their supply chains. Of course, we all have vested interests, but given that many brand owners have made some very public commitments, and I've just picked sort of four here. I've got Nestle, Danone, Unilever, and Coca-Cola. These public commitments are generally relating to goals like collection, recycling, and recycled content. Many of these brand owners will be looking to PROs and to some extent EPR regulation to help them achieve these targets that they've set for themselves and shared publicly. It's important to realize most of these targets are higher than the targets set by government. So in this case, there's clear alignment between the objectives of brand owners and potentially with government. And that to some extent, brand owners actually end up pushing PROs and EPR further than government. In addition, it's important to realize that where materials used attract high EPR fees because they're hard to recycle or low recycling rates spark public outrage, brand owners are uniquely placed in the value chain to redesign their products to be more readily collected and recycled. And so often one of the definitions of used as the producer is it's the person that has the ability to influence or make a decision regarding the use of a material that is subject to EPR. And you can see from that case, it's most usually the brand owner. Doesn't matter who makes the product, whether it's a third-party packing or whether it's in your own factory, who makes the decisions. Lastly, in terms of the context of EPR, it's important to consider the actors in the value chain and the nature of the challenge at hand. EPR is really about collection. Recycling is important, but the key outcome is that we prevent materials from accumulating in the environment, in the oceans, or being landfilled. And in this space, it's important to acknowledge that collection is fundamentally a multi-substrate activity. Consumers don't only use PET or HDPE or cardboard. Collections from households has to be a multi-substrate exercise. Whether it's done by formal waste management services or by the informal sector, to be sustainable, it must be multi-substrate. In some places, I know you see multiple bins, but those systems are extremely costly. And so practically, the way to address it is really to have recyclables being collected in a single process. And in this aspect, we have very good alignment with brand owners, as brand owners too are multi-substrate. Very few of them will make or use only one material. In fact, I can't think of any. Even if you largely use glass or you largely use PET, you still may use a metal crown, you still may use a paper label, you still may use a plastic shrink wrap around your glass bottle. If you do PET, you still may use an HDPE closure, a BOPP label, a cardboard under the box. So very, very few producers brand owners are producing only one material. And so from this perspective, they are very well aligned with the challenge of collecting multiple materials. Although converters, and by that I mean generally in the context of packaging industry, but in other industries it could be third-party manufacturers and recyclers, clearly have a vested interest in the success of EPR policy. They're generally focused on one material or related materials. And therefore their leadership or participation in collection and recycling initiatives is often focused on the materials that they represent. And it tends to be difficult for them to look at multiple materials. And so fundamentally, the concerns and objectives of the brand owner tend to be more aligned with EPR than others in the value chain. So in order to move from activities that are either organic or initiated by industry, but focus on selected materials, we need a strong alignment between the broader application of mandatory EPR that is aligned to activity, and it needs the cooperation of the brand owners. And so I want to come back to the slide I showed you earlier. EPR is a journey, and each country is in a different place. In fact, generally each product or each material in each country is in a different place. Some are being collected with little or no assistance, and in some cases, as I said earlier, many emerging markets are actually doing better than places like the USA for some materials. However, these successes are often limited to materials like aluminum cans, PET bottles, some HDPE bottles, and cardboard. But outside of formal collection and EPR-led systems, there are just too many materials that fall through the cracks. And I'm not just talking about difficult to recycle plastics like multi-layer films. Whilst many people propose glass as a replacement for PET, for example, the reality is that in Africa, unless you have a glass producer nearby, you will almost have no glass recycling at all. It just isn't worth collecting and transporting glass any great distance at all. In South Africa, it's almost not practical to transform it from Johannesburg to Cape Town. And so even for something that's relatively easy to recycle, like glass, the economics of collection and recycling are not going to be overcome in many countries without intervention. And that economic intervention, that closing of the gap that will make collecting, separating, processing, and hopefully using the product to produce the same item again, is EPR. And whilst it's important for things like PET bottles to raise collection rates and increase circular recycling, EPR and regulated EPR in particular is critical for hard to recycle, or what I call the low value, no value materials that are unfortunately all too common. Unless we can both discourage their use by applying eco-modulated EPR fees, like I mentioned earlier, so in other words, things that are hard to recycle get higher EPR fee, and subsidize their collection and recycling, they will continue to be used, and they will continue to accumulate in landfills, in our streets, and on our oceans. In closing, I would like to once again highlight the progression that I've showed on the previous slide. One of the practical challenges of EPR, collection and recycling initiatives, is that you are essentially juggling three balls: collection rate, processing capacity, and end-use demand. Although it may seem attractive to try and jump from 0 to DRS, for example, it really isn't that easy. One of the critical lessons that we've learned at Petco over the last 15 years is that if you don't balance these three elements, you will fail. And the truth is that some of these are easier to move faster than the others. So, for example, collection could be increased overnight, for example, by just offering more money for the material you want collected. We've seen this in a number of African countries. We increase the price we're prepared to pay for PET bottles, they come. The free market solves the problem. But if you want to get above 50 or 60%, or maybe even 70% collection, then you're going to have to change consumer habits. And you're going to have to work with municipalities and residents on things like separation at source programs. Processing capacity, on the other hand, is generally more of a challenge. Equipment takes time to finance, to order, to install, to get operational. You need skills to do it and to do it properly. And so if you ramp up collection, but you don't have processing capacity, what are you going to do with it all? Once you have enough processing capacity, you need to sell it to someone. End-use demand could be a major constraint if your economy is isolated. In other words, the end-use demand needs to be local if your country is isolated. And then this itself needs investment in capacity building. Or it may not be a challenge at all if your market is relatively small and if the material collected and processed could be easily exported. So, for example, we were discussing an example with Malta, for example. Malta could fast track this process because all that they could collect could be sold into the European market very easily because they're so small. The bottom line is it's very difficult to go from nothing to 70% collection in a short time. It looks tempting, as I said, to jump straight to DRS, but this is seldom practical because the system will not be balanced. Equally, implementation of bans and taxes sound good in theory, And in some cases, there might be a place for this. So things that are really hard to recycle, for example,
confronté
that can be part of the solution. But seldom do these bans and taxes address the fundamental challenges of enabling a balanced circular economy, like the progression of EPR does. And so I hope to leave you with a better understanding of what EPR is and why EPR interventions need to be fit for purpose firstly, and then change and evolve as conditions and ambitions change. So that's a lot to think about. I'm sure you have some questions. I look forward to expanding and answering them. Anthony, Tara, over to you.
Thank you so much, David. That was very informative and well structured in terms of understanding all the ins and outs of EPR. I don't see any questions in the chat yet, but please feel free to send those through either in the chat box or the Q&A box. In the meantime, David, I was wondering if you could comment on the deposit return scheme that I think Coca-Cola implemented about a year or two ago. I think they were charging a bit more for a bottle with the idea that that consumers would then return the bottle as part of the scheme. Can you comment at all on that and whether or not it was successful, some challenges that or possible opportunities there?
Sure. So I think the first thing is to apologize for using confusing language, and I think this is something that's very important to get right. There are essentially two systems that we talk about, and perhaps some of these are Coke-isms or localisms. But firstly, let's separate deposit return schemes from returnable or refillable packaging. I like to call it refillable packaging. But the people who write the press releases say that people like to call it returnable. So fundamentally, there's a difference between packaging that's refillable and packaging that is returned for deposit. In both cases, you can have a deposit, but the system that we launched in South Africa in 2019 was a refillable 2-liter bottle. Now, it's in PET, so a lot of you will be familiar with refillable glass. But refillable PET is relatively new, certainly new to some places. It's been used in South America for quite a long time, and it's actually been used in the Western Cape in South Africa for many years already. But what we did was we expanded to introduce a 2-liter bottle, which was the first. And essentially, that bottle is a much heavier, sturdier PET bottle, so it's still PET. It goes into the market. It has a deposit that's paid by the consumer, which is a fairly hefty deposit. And that deposit is then credited to the consumer when the bottle is returned by the consumer. And in essence, that is a bottle that we want back. And that is a bottle that we will then wash and check, make sure that it meets our strict hygiene standards, and then refill it and reuse it. And a bottle like that, we believe, can be used from what we've seen in South America and what we see in the Western Cape, probably about 10 to 14 times. Okay, so from a plastic usage perspective, it achieves a number of things. One, it reduces the plastic footprint of a 2-liter bottle. So essentially it weighs just a little bit more than double what a normal PET bottle would weigh, but it gets used 10 to 14 times instead of once. Secondly, you get a really good return rate. So we get return rates in excess of 95%. So in other words, our collection for those bottles is above 95%. They come back. And they come back because of the deposit. So that has been relatively successful. It's obviously launched right in the middle of COVID, but it has still grown enormously over the last year. So I think from January to September of last year, the sales rate increased about 10 times, but off a relatively small base. So it's something that we committed to and something that we believe we've got to continue to grow. Because as part of the solution, collection, increasing our recycled content, increasing refillables, whether they're in glass or whether they're in PET, is definitely part of the long-term plan, and probably should be part of the plan for many brands. If those of you who've seen TerraCycle or Loop will see some amazingly inventive solutions that are being applied for way more than just beverages. So beverages have been doing returnables for years, but things like cosmetics, and even a very interesting scheme run with Burger King, replacing hamburger shells and fast food packaging on a returnable, reusable system. So the items get get returned and get reused. Deposit return systems are something different entirely. That's when you attach a deposit to a single-use material or single-use bottle, and those are the kinds of systems that we see in a number of European countries, and those are the systems that I was referring to as being the sort of the last step in the chain. And that's where you take a bottle that's not going to be refilled, you attach a deposit to it, and then you credit that deposit when the consumer returns the bottle. So in other words, the consumer returns the bottle to the place that they bought it, or to a facility that will offer them a credit, and gets their money back for doing that. That bottle, however, isn't reused, the bottle is recycled. And there are a number of challenges with that kind of system in a developing environment, particularly to do with the cost and the implementation in largely informal, or let's say not your typical top-end retail environment, which is where those systems work quite well. And also it can have a negative impact on informal collection, because the bottles that the informal collection is relying on for income now get taken directly by the consumer and taken back to the store. So DRS works very well in developed countries, and to my knowledge, there's not a sort of successful implementation in what we would call a developing country or an emerging market. It's certainly something that's going to be tested in the future. So I hope that explains the difference between refillables and a DRS system. And just to be clear, the systems that I was referring to were the single-use products onto which you had a deposit that are then returned by the consumer directly to the store or to a return vending machine. I hope that clarifies.
Thank you, David. That's great to hear. I think often there's a fair amount of confusion around all the terminology that's used. And yeah, yes, I see, Tony, you have your hand raised.
Yes, I do, but I see, should we do Chris White's question first, and question and answer?
Sure. So there's a question that says, thanks, David. Clear and precise. How, though, do we avoid the gap collection, processing, demand through alternative vertically integrated technologies that look beyond product-to-product recycling, like rPET? For example, energy, plastic roads, and other applications that drive the market, such as glass that can be recycled into over 30 other products other than glass. Who needs to assist beyond EPR stakeholders to drive this?
Thank you, Chris. That's a great question. And I think one of the fundamental things that we've got to remember, and to some extent, I think you've got to look at how the structure of EPR works and how EPR targets are set. And the important thing to realize is that EPR generally targets an outcome. Okay, so in other words, the EPR regulation will say to industry, to the users and all the sort of vested interests, we need to achieve 50%, 60%, 70%, whatever the target is, by a certain amount of time. One of the fundamental challenges that we have, for example, in the glass industry in South Africa, is that the target for collection had been largely set by the requirements of the recycler. Okay, so to some extent, how much glass needed to be collected was determined by how much glass the recycler, being the glass industry, could consume. And to some extent, there was no point in collecting more glass than was required. Under EPR and under EPR regulation, you turn that on its head and you say you need to recover 50% or 60% of the glass that's put on the market. And then what essentially happens is that if 80% of that can go back into making new glass bottles, what are you going to do with the rest? Okay, and then you need to solve for, as a PRO or as an industry or whoever it is. And essentially what you need to do is say, okay, I now have to collect more glass than my recycler can take. So now I've got a couple of options. I either need to grow my glass manufacturing to consume more of this glass, or I need to look for other outlets, like in Australia, they use glass to build roads. There are a lot of sort of creative ways of using the glass. Now, what's important to realize is that once you now have to try and find these other uses, okay, so they may not be circular, but you need to use them and you need to incorporate them into your EPR scheme. because they are going to have to use the material that you've collected in order to achieve your collection target. And if you don't use it, as I said, you're going to build up a stockpile, and then eventually you're probably going to bury it in a hole. Okay, when it comes to plastics, and what we see in many places is people burn it. So in other words, plastic has nowhere to go. Even if it's been collected, it then ends up being burnt. And in many places in Africa, it just gets burnt on open sort of dumps, doesn't achieve anything by burning it. Whereas in Europe, what we see is that the material that can be used gets reused, and the material that can't be used goes into waste to energy, or it goes into now increasingly, or Chris mentioned, things like pyrolysis. So in other words, you start looking for those other outlets for the use. Now, to give an example, how do you work? How does EPR work in that context? Well, you can imagine that something like plastic has value, and probably has more value if it's recycled back into a circular application. And so generally what we see is that circular applications retain more value than non-circular applications. Okay, so in some places, for example, leftover PET is burnt in cement kilns. Okay, and in that space, what is the value of the PET? Well, it's very simple. It's the equivalent cost of the calorific value of coal that it replaces. So if they're burning coal, or if they're burning plastic, they will essentially pay you the same amount per calorie. Okay, that's probably going to be a lot less than you would get if you were turning it into polyester staple fiber, or you're turning it into strapping, or you're turning it into bottle to bottle. And so what's important to realize is that these applications have a very important niche to fill, but what they will do is that they will potentially cost the industry more, because if we go back to my slide, that value on the right-hand side now shrinks. And what happens when that value shrinks is the EPR gap grows. Unless you can reduce the processing and separation cost on the left-hand side by equivalent amount, then the potential is the EPR gap for some of those applications grows. But they have to be part of the problem. They have to be part of the solution to the problem, sorry. So it's important to realize that once EPR drives the process and says, this is the target that you have to achieve, you then have to say, if I achieve that target, what do I do with all the material I've collected? Okay, so much can go into this application, so much can go into that application. And then you have to find the last things on your list. And essentially, you should put it into the cheapest and most circular applications first, and the most expensive and the least circular applications last. But they are likely to be part of your solution. And so things like pyrolysis and waste to energy are definitely part of the future of EPR systems and waste management. And we see that increasingly in Europe. Otherwise, you're collecting, separating, and then putting it back into landfill, which makes absolutely no sense. I hope that answers Chris's question.
Thanks, David. It's great to know that the ideal route to take in terms of implementing the collection first, and then once you have all the recycled material, to then find uses for it. There are a few more questions that have come through that says, thanks and a good and understanding presentation. As the most of the presentation was focused on recycling, my colleagues and I collect all kinds of plastic, including plastic bottles, but we don't have recycling methods or other companies which recycle bottles. So is there any method which you would suggest?
Well, I think that proves exactly my point about balancing the bubbles. Okay, 3 balls: collect, process, and end-use demand. And if you get them out of balance, you really have a problem. And so in what we've done in Petco, and what we've learned in Petco over the last 15 years, is that we've seen the challenge move from bubble to bubble, from year to year. And if you don't address that carefully, and so if you have programs that focus drastically on collection, or you have programs that says, we're going to go and invest a recycling plant in this country, and this country, and this country, and yet you haven't looked at whether you can collect enough material to feed those, what you're going to have is sort of some very negative experiences along the collection value chain. And so one of the things that I believe strongly in, and from what we've learned in Petco, and what we see in South Africa, and what we're learning in East Africa, and what we're learning in West Africa, The reality is that not every market is big enough to have a recycling industry that operates at scale. And by that, I mean full recycling. So whether it's, you know, bottle to fiber in the case of PET, or bottle to bottle even, there are economies of scale that are necessary for these projects to work. And what you often find in Africa, and so I have more experience in South and East Africa, but increasingly looking at West Africa as well, a number of the markets are so small that if you took every PET bottle in that whole country, so in other words, you achieve 100% collection, you will not be able to establish a bottle-to-bottle recycling plant, because there's just not enough PET for you to establish a plant that's going to be operational at scale and be able to produce material at a price that is going to enable the person doing it to make a profit. And so what we see is that you need to create regional solutions. Regional solutions are going to bring together the volume from a number of countries in order to create the scale, in order to be able to set up a plant that is going to be able to operate efficiently and to make a profit. And so we've got no shortage of people wanting to invest in plants across Africa. The challenge is, can we make sure that the projects that we support, as Coca-Cola in particular, are going to be successful? And so when we look at East Africa, for example, and let's be clear, Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda are some of the bigger PET markets in Africa, outside of the really big giants, you know, the Egypt, Nigeria, South Africa. Those are the big markets, okay? They are certainly in the top 10. But on their own, even, they're still too small to run a bottle-to-bottle plant. So if you can't do it in Kenya on your own, then you probably can't do it in Togo or, or one of the smaller countries. It's not going to happen. You can't do it in Botswana. You can't do it in Namibia. You can't even do it in Mozambique. So we need to realize that economies of scale are critical. But what we can do, and what we have to do, is we have to look at setting up primary recycling in country. And that's for two reasons. The one is that we want activity in country. When there's activity in country, we create local value, and local value creates a more environment that is more conducive to collection and recycling. If we have local activity, we can have local EPR that can support that activity. But it doesn't mean that every country has to have a bottle-to-bottle plant, or a bottle-to-fiber plant, or a bottle-to-strapping. Strapping is a bit smaller. But local processing is probably going to be limited in many countries to wash and flake, or wash and flake and pelletize. And if you do that, and you do that well, that product now is no longer waste, okay? And because it's no longer waste, and because it's probably 95% or more pure, it can travel. It becomes a raw material. It's like exporting iron ore instead of sort of mined sand, okay? If you just exported the raw ore out of the earth, you know, it wouldn't be practical. So what do? You process it and you get it to iron ore. Once it's iron ore, you can export it and sell it. And that's essentially what wash flake becomes. And the market for wash flake is actually very strong at the moment. And so what we believe is that we need to encourage people in country to do what I call primary processing, or primary recycling. So in other words, collect the bottles, sort them, wash them, flake them, either hot wash or even cold wash can do, and do it well. Do it well so that the material that you produce can be used by someone else in some other country that has a bottle-to-bottle plant or has a bottle-to-fiber plant. And those networks, you know, if people are looking for help, we certainly can connect them. I had a call the other day saying, I've got 2 buyers in Portugal desperate for material. Do I know of anyone in Africa that can supply them? And so these are the things that we can do in Africa, in smaller markets, to supply material to start with, probably to Europe. Okay, everyone's worried about Europe dumping their waste in Africa. Well, we're going to get our own back, I can tell you now. We're going to take PET, collect it, turn it to flake, and send it back to them. Okay, longer term, however, we want that value add to remain in Africa. And we want that value add to be feeding into bottle-to-bottle plants established in regional hubs in West Africa, East Africa, South Africa, North Africa. And if we can do that, then we can keep the value and we can maintain more circularity in Africa. And if we do that, we're reducing imports, we're reducing forex, and we are creating a circular economy within Africa. And so for those of you that are struggling to sell material, you're not alone. In the PET space, you can't easily export unwashed bottles and bales like you could a few years ago. That's all been stopped. So you need to do some primary processing. And even for things like HDPE, that's also probably the right thing to do. So look at what you can do at scale that you have in your country, and produce a product that people want both within your country and potentially outside of your country, particularly in the PET space. And I know that space better than HDPE, for example. There's a good market for good quality, clean washed clay. I hope that helps.
Thank you, David. There's another question here that says, thank you very much for this, David. Very interesting. From your experience and feedback from the Western Cape versus the Eastern Cape, do you think the Eastern Cape will eventually be able to reach the level of reusing, recycling, and returning as the Western Cape? Or is this a bit of a pipe dream?
So, look, we certainly hope so. And as some of you may know, and probably the person asking the question may know, that the pilot that we did on the 2-liter returnable or refillable bottle, as I prefer to call it, 2-liter refillable, was in the Eastern Cape, and it was fairly successful in the Eastern Cape. The thing to remember about refillables is that they generally work within a, let's call it a geographical boundary. You can't have refillables, let's say, being produced in Johannesburg and being exported and being sold all around the country. It's just not practical. And what it means is that the cost of getting the bottles there and getting the empties back becomes unsustainable. And it's also a carbon footprint issue, as you can imagine. Transporting empty bottles is costing a lot in terms of trucks and fuel. So what you see with refillables is that they tend to work around a factory hub. So in the Eastern Cape, that factory is in Port Elizabeth. And so we would certainly have expectations that within, let's call it Port Elizabeth, we would see a similar performance to what we see in the Western Cape. But for example, the Eastern Cape itself is enormous, and how the refillable bottle would not be able to reach, sort of the length and breadth of the Eastern Cape as much as we would like, without establishing another node. So, for example, we've got a node there, we've got a node in Johannesburg, we've got a node in Polokwane, and we will roll out other nodes across the country, but very much tied to in and around a factory. So from that perspective, refillables is very difficult in a large geographic area to replace one-way packaging with refillables. But certainly you could see an equivalent performance of refillables in the Eastern Cape, or perhaps in Limpopo, as you do in the Western Cape.
Thank you, David. There aren't any more questions in the Q&A box at this time, but I have a question. Do you have an opinion on an upstream approach for EPR that would apply to raw materials? Because I know you mentioned that one of the issues in terms of glass recycling is that the raw material is much cheaper than your collected material. So if there was some sort of measure of control over the cost of virgin materials in terms of oil as well, how would that influence the system? Or would it be viable?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I've thought about that. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Minderoo Foundation, and they're talking about ocean plastic and talking about a sort of a plastics tax on the raw material to fund that kind of thing, which is a very interesting concept. On the one hand, I like the idea in that it's very simple. So if you look at the number of raw material providers, they're much fewer than the number of brand owners or packaging converters. However, there's a challenge. And the challenge is very important in terms of the concept of EPR. And whilst in some materials it might be doable. So for example, you talk about glass. Glass is reasonably, let's say, consistent. But in other words, the difficulty in recycling the product is fairly independent of the design of the bottle or the color or whatever else. But there's still an impact. Okay, so the difference between green glass and clear glass. Clear glass can go back into anything. Green glass can only go back into green glass. Brown glass can go back into green glass, or it can go into brown glass. So you have these limitations. And the challenge with applying let's call it the EPR fee at raw material level, is that you eliminate the ecomodulation. And why is that important? Well, what you got to appreciate. So let's take PET, because I know the subject quite well. And if we look at PET, and to some extent, this is one of the challenges we've had in Petco for a while now. We do apply the fee at raw material. The problem is that what that raw material goes into cannot be determined at the point that the raw material is bought or sold. Okay, so if I import PET to South Africa and I was charged a EPR fee on it, or some kind of levy or something like that, that would go to some kind of system or fund. The problem is some of that material could be going to clear PET beverage bottles, which are highly recycled and highly recyclable. Some of it could be going to edible oil bottles, which are not particularly well recycled. Some of it might be going to thermoform packaging, so your kind of clamshells and things like that, which are also not particularly well recycled. And so under the theory of EPR, what you should see is you should see differentiation on the EPR fee attached to those different products. So for example, if you use a white opaque master batch in PET, you virtually make it unrecyclable. And so what you see in many countries in Europe is a very high EPR fee, for example, on colored PET, and particularly opaque colored PET. So in other words, you might have three, you might have clear, colored, and opaque. Okay, and opaque basically means you can't be recycled. But at the point at which that raw material is produced or bought and sold, you don't know how much is going to go into clear and how much is going to go into opaque. And the problem with that, although you could say, well, let's take an average, okay, 80% is clear and 10% is green and 5% is blue, and then the rest of the colors all sit in the last 5%, which is probably true. The problem is you're not going to charge the guy that's using the opaque more than the guy that's using the clear. So how are you going to drive the right behavior, which is get rid of color, in order to make things more recyclable by applying the fee at the raw material level? It applies also to things like polypropylene. If you were to apply clear polypropylene, easy to recycle, great. Laminated polypropylene, completely different story. One of the most difficult things to recycle. So you could say clear polypropylene needs a relatively low EPR fee, but laminated metallized polypropylene film could have a significantly higher EPR fee. And that's the way that it should be in order to drive people to use the right materials. So in other words, if you want to use laminated polypropylene, you just have to be prepared to pay a higher EPR fee. But the economics of it are going to drive people towards perhaps monolayer. And you'll see a lot of development in the flexible space now towards monolayer materials. Why? Because they are easier to recycle. So what you would want is a lower EPR fee on monolayer than on multi-layer with multiple materials. And you can't do that if you charge it at the raw material level. And so, although it sounds really simple, and it might have a place, for example, in the greater scheme of EPR, it cannot be the only measure. So what we see in Europe with this thing about virgin plastic tax and things like that, that raw material charge or that levy is playing a different role. It's a complementary role to the EPR, mandatory EPR, and in some cases DRS systems that you have. And what it's trying to do is to say that if the virgin price is consistently too low, in order to drive consumption of recycled material, we have to artificially make virgin plastic more expensive, okay? But we're not doing that. We're just doing that on a binary basis, virgin, recycled. We're not saying we're differentiating between well-designed and poorly designed, because they have that as well. They have that in the EPR as well. So it can be done, and there possibly is a space for it. But again, if you remember my graph, it's way on the right-hand side. It's after you've got the voluntary and regulated EPR, and you've built up a system that works, that then you can bring in one of these things to add to it, potentially if you have a situation like low oil prices, low virgin prices that are just not making the system sustainable. So I would say it's complementary, but it certainly doesn't replace well-structured EPR with eco-modulation of fees applied at the product at the end, at the point at which the product is finally determined.
Thank you for such a thorough answer. It's great to have the full explanation of of why they wouldn't work as opposed to EPR. There are a few other questions that have come through in the box here that says, thanks for the interesting presentation. Several of the more problematic packaging types, lightweight flexibles, are used for low-cost products like corn-based chips or cheap biscuits. For these products, the cost of the packaging is proportionally far higher than many other items. With eco-modulated EPR fees, this could have a more significant impact on the price of the item. Is there a trade-off between EPR and cost to consumer, particularly for the lower end of the market?
Yeah. So the question is, do you want to resolve the problem or not? So, and I'm being facetious, because the reality is that one of the primary reasons that we have this problem, why we have plastic in our oceans, why we have uncontrolled accumulation of plastic in the environment, is that plastic is one of the most cheap and efficient solutions for the packaging of food and beverage. Okay, it is, when it comes to things like, if you think about small packets of chips and small sweet wrappers and things like that, they have replaced what used to be used because they are better and cheaper. Okay, so to some extent, the way that you've got to think about this is that one of the challenges we have, and that's why I'm so passionate about saying we have to find the most efficient and cost-effective solutions. And we don't have room for wasteful taxes, particularly in emerging markets, is because that cost, whether it's EPR or tax or whatever, will be passed on to the consumer. And if we make things, if we do these things badly, and we make them too expensive without achieving what we're going to do, we could dramatically increase hunger, standard or decrease standard of living, or have impacts on health, particularly when it comes to things that are being protected by plastics. So what we have to do is we have to say, there is going to be a cost, potentially, of doing things better. And if we are going to apply EPR correctly, it may make some of those things that are cheap today expensive. And it's being done intentionally to say you can't use a cheap solution that is at the cost, ultimately, of the environment. And that's the biggest challenge that we have as emerging economies in the developing world in terms of EPR. It costs money. And we just don't have as much of it as the developed world. You know, there's some very interesting data, and I can't remember the reference offhand. I think it's Binkman or something like that, that correlates how much plastic is used in the developed world and then looks at where plastic pollution happens. And what's very clear is that per capita, the developing world does not use more plastic than the rich countries. Rich countries use more plastic by far, but they don't have the pollution that we have, because they have the waste management systems that we don't have. But those waste management systems come at a cost. And so waste management is really a cost that we have to make sure that we can bear. And to some extent, that's why I believe EPR, coming right back to the whole point of this conversation, is the most efficient means to do this. We see a number of countries that apply a tax on this and a tax on that, and then say, we still aren't achieving our collection goals. We still see bottles in the streets. And the reality is that that tax, that levy, or whatever it was on plastic or on bottles or on something, isn't going back to provide the services that are needed to clean up that waste. And as long as you do that, you're applying a cost, but you're not reinvesting in the solution. Whereas EPR says, apply the cost, make that packet of chips more expensive, but take that money and use it to clean up the packet of chips. Because that externality, that cost to the environment, the cost of living in a clean environment is gone. It has to be borne by the person, the company that makes that packet of chips, and the person that buys that packet of chips. And it should be costed correctly. And if it's costed correctly and there is a better solution that becomes cheaper, remember, so it's not just about the cost of the material, it's now the combined cost of the material and the EPR fee. It may make another solution cheaper. So I like the example of Smarties versus M&Ms. Okay, I enjoy both of them. But the Smarties is in a cardboard box that should be recycled, and even if it isn't, it's going to be biodegradable. The M&Ms comes in a polypropylene laminate. Just, they both compete equally. Maybe it's slightly cheaper to use the polypropylene laminate, but if you choose the Smarties, Smarties can be competitive. So why not just sell M&Ms in a Smartie box? It can be done. And if you applied EPR fees to that polypropylene laminate, you would probably see someone like M&Ms move from polypropylene laminates to a Smartie box. So yes, there can be implications, but I believe that people will find solutions that are more recyclable and possibly nearly as competitive without causing a major issue. But if we don't apply that pressure, we won't see the innovation that will move packaging into these more sustainable formats.
Thank you, David. There's one last question here from Peter that says, what is the future of plastic recycling amidst COVID-19 induced uncertainties, including fossil fuel prices, cross-country trade, transport logistics, safety and markets, policy uncertainties across all countries?
Sure, just a few things. I think the essence of it is that what we've seen in this COVID crisis is that the value chains of recycling have been severely tested. Okay, what we saw in the beginning were lockdowns and inactivity and lack of materials sold. And to some extent, I think we've seen a lot of people opt out of the collection space. We can see in South Africa, collection is still struggling. We see a lot of traders in waste that have collapsed because of the crisis and COVID. So in other words, people who used to buy and collect have either run out of money during lockdown, or they've run out of money in South Africa because we had things like an alcohol ban. And aluminum cans, as I mentioned earlier, are very valuable. And so when you take all the aluminum cans out of the market, either because of alcohol bans or because of less activity in restaurants and out-of-home events, the reality is that has a negative impact on the value chain. And so we know the value chain has taken strain. We saw initially oil prices collapse and virgin raw materials come way down. But we've seen that recover, fortunately. And what we've seen in the PET space now, fortunately, is that the demand, both for polyester staple fiber and for bottle to bottle, is really strong. The one very important lesson that we learned is that circular systems are far more resilient than non-circular systems. Okay, so in bottle to bottle, what we saw in the Coke system in Mexico, for example, we saw in collection and recycling increase during the COVID crisis, because the majority of bottles being collected were not going into some faraway land making fiber pillows. They were being used for bottle to bottle in country. And so I believe that the future really must be about creating more local consumption. And whether, even if it's to the earlier question, waste to energy, or what some people call downcycling or pyrolysis, or some ingenuitive methods like making roads or whatever else out of glass. The thing is that if it's more related to your local economy, you tend to see a better balance between production and demand. When you're reliant on somewhere far, far away to consume your material, you have more risk that something out of your control on the other side of the world will reduce demand for what you're collecting and recycling. And so in Uganda, for example, where we run a recycling plant as Coca-Cola, for months, we couldn't sell anything because the people that we were selling to in the Far East had shut down their mills. If we'd had a bottle-to-bottle plant in Uganda or in Kenya or in somewhere close by, we were still making Coke. We were still using PET. That system could have continued. So I think that the solution lies more in more circularity, more local circularity, and those systems will become less dependent on the vagaries of global economic ups and downs. But if you read the Pew Foundation's report on breaking the plastic wave, it's probably likely that recycled content is going to remain more expensive than virgin material for the foreseeable future, which means that we have to understand that we're going to pay a premium for recycled content, and we're going to have to pay EPR fees to help it be recycled. And that's just the reality of what's going to happen. So I think we must kind of get out of our heads that we can produce and recycle and produce stuff that's cheaper than the alternatives. We've got to get used to the fact that we have to use recycled content. It is going to cost a little bit more. Obviously, we want it to be competitive. We want it to be as affordable as possible. But we shouldn't be setting virgin plastic as the benchmark anymore. It should really be about, I need X amount of recycled content in order to be sustainable, in order to be socially acceptable, in order to meet my commitments as a corporate citizen. And then it's about finding it in the most competitive way, as opposed to saying, should I use virgin or virgin's cheap, I'm going to use less rPET. You can't do that anymore. It's not going to work. And if you do, you're never going to use recycled content. It's always going to be more expensive, even if it's just slightly more expensive. So more local, more circular.
Thank you so much, David, for the incredibly thorough answers. I don't see any other questions that have come through now, but if anyone does have questions at a later stage or watching the recording, you're welcome to email us at webinars@sstafrica.org.za, and we'll be happy to pass those along. I think for now we can close here for today. Thank you so much, David. We do have another session taking place on Thursday with Professor Reza Daniels. So you're all very, very welcome to join us for that, and we really encourage you to join. You can use the same link to register as you used for today's session. But for now, I'd just like to say again, thank you everyone for joining us today, and a special thank you, David, for the incredibly interesting and thorough explanation of EPR and all the ins and outs. I think it's been very enlightening for everyone here today. Tony, oh, thanks, David. Tony, I don't know if you want to add anything.
David, that was superb. Thank you very much indeed. I wonder, David, if you and Tara would stay on for a moment just to take it further from here, but and to thank all of those who have attended today. Really great. David, you covered an enormous amount, and what was particularly pleasing for me was the way in which you related items that should actually go into national plans, and then the call for what then could go into regional plans and the types of decisions that need to guide that. And in that way, it gives a pointer to the sorts of things that we should be including in the document that comes out of the series in terms of decision-making frameworks for countries and regions. So from me, thank you very much indeed. I thought it was superb. And I see Chris says thank you as well. So thank you, David. And we will, in fact, I'm sure, have much more to do with you going forward. To the rest, thanks very much.
Pleasure, everyone.
And we
Thank
hope
you for your
to see
time.
you and others on Thursday.